So in UP, when we first went to work there, young women and boys couldn't actually describe aspiration. They didn't have a Hindi word for it.
Adolescents, by nature of that age, love to challenge norms. I mean, that is literally their existence.
Yeah. As long as you'll continue to send a 15-year-old woman out with her 7-year-old brother, saying that, oh, he will keep you safe.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no way I'm going to internalize anything.
We often say in education, right, you can't be what you don't see.
Hi, welcome to today's episode of Decoding Impact. I'm your host, Rathish Balakrishnan. Latest periodic labor force survey shows that women labor force participation has increased to 32% today. However, only 15% of women are actually getting salaried jobs. And irrespective of where we are today, we are far away from the government's ambition of getting the labor force participation target to 70%. Over the last 3 years, we've had many conversations that spoke about the challenges that hold women back from work. One of the pervasive conversations we've constantly had is the role of norms and gender norms. To understand the role of norms and what it takes to solve for them, we have two exceptional women who've joined us today in our conversation. Sohini Bhattacharya is a former CEO of Breakthrough, where she spent over 25 years and has constantly led both global and national conversations on gender norms. Also joining us today is Erin Ganju. She is the co-founder and former CEO of Room to Read, where she impacted over 45 million children. And she was also the managing director at Echidna Giving, which was one of the largest private funders focused on gender equality in education in lower income countries. Erin and Sohini are today bringing together 12 different organizations from across the globe to understand what it truly takes to shift gender norms globally. Erin, Sohini, thank you so much for joining us today. Interestingly, since we started this podcast 3 years ago, every year we talk about the issue of gender and women economic empowerment. Through different talks with entrepreneurs, economists, gender experts, etc., one of the questions that we always ask people is, what is holding women back? Right? And the answer to this question is as polarizing in every episode. Right? There are those who fundamentally believe that norms does not have any role to play in the economic activity of women. We are not giving women the right opportunities, or it's not economically viable anymore, and that is the only reason women are taking jobs. Two, saying that the fundamental social fabric holds women back from the kind of opportunities that they should be pursuing. And more than what others say, it is the internalization of that voice of what it means for women that becomes a conversation that happens in their own head that holds them back, right? And so I've always wanted to, for the longest time, do an entire podcast episode just on the issue of norms. I cannot find better experts than the two of you to actually be part of this conversation. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I'm going to start with first principles, right? Just assume people who are listening to this podcast haven't heard about norms at all before. How do you define this discussion on norms for anyone?
So norms are these really unwritten rules that sets your behavior. It's what people expect you to behave, and then what you expect others to expect you to behave. So for example, when I want to get my daughter married off at, let's say, 21, but I know my community is expecting me to get her married at 16. So I give in to gender norms because I think that is the expected behavior, even if my belief is not that. And so I get her married at 16. Right. So that's gender norms. And those norms are really embedded, entrenched in our society so deeply that it is difficult to shift them.
And I think a really interesting thing about norms, and those are great examples, right? I think it helps to unpack and give some specifics about these behaviors and the way we interact, because it's how we, are expected to contribute to our families, our communities, our workplaces, right? But the interesting thing about norms, and this is an opportunity I invite us to, think about more in this conversation, is they can change over time. Yeah. So, now I would say pretty traditional norms still, despite a lot of effort, globally, is that we still have these expectations that women are caregivers and men are, the earners, the breadwinners, right? Those are actually pretty entrenched.
Both of you had a view of being able to see norms globally. You've seen this work in Africa, you've seen this work in Asia and US. Is there a lot of difference across countries? What remains the same and what is very, very different?
I don't think that is actually sort of some of the work that we're engaged in right now. We have developed a collective project that is, kind of a collective action project that has 12 organizations all working on, this is for the adolescent space, but all working on adolescent gender norms and how they can be shifted within education. And one of the interesting things is we have members from Latin America, from various countries in Africa and Asia, and we're even amongst ourselves, organizations that for a couple of decades, most of them have been working, doing deep work in school systems around adolescent gender norms. We ourselves are even asking and developing ways in which we can have that conversation about what is deeply rooted in our culture and what's common in some of these norms across cultures, right?
And I think in the global north, as we know, the treatment that you mete out to boys and girls in school might be the same. You might be giving the same kind of opportunities to both, boys and girls. But in many of the global, South countries, there is still a huge difference in the way you are treating girls and the way you are treating boys in the same school. Or when it comes to sports, I think equal chances given to everybody. But in here, and especially in India and in many other parts of South Asia, I see that, girls are not invited for sports.
It's interesting because it's at such a surface level, right? I hear you saying that, but I know, we say, oh yes, girls, and in the context of the U.S., for example, are given equal access to sports, right? Yet when you actually look at where resources go, no, not at all. If you look at universities, or you even at the secondary school levels, there's so much more attention, so much more dollars put towards boys' sports and girls' sports. I mean, even look at recent lawsuits around the women's soccer federation or football federation, et cetera. When you just go one step down, it's actually still pretty much based on these norms we hold, that are not that different.
And we're talking about US and India, but even within India, Bihar to Tamil Nadu, there's a massive difference. And I remember I read this book called Unequal, where they talked about why anemia cases in Bihar are much more than even Bangladesh, for example, or Nepal. Because in Nepal, the behavior of women to eat after everybody at home is eaten is not a very prevalent norm. But in Bihar, it is that everybody has to finish eating and then the women will eat. Almost always you don't have enough food to eat. And the choices are defined by what is left and not what you need. And Bangladesh is not too far out, right? It's quite close by. But even in these microcosms of culture, we see how norms are so uniquely defined and so on. Yeah. One related question, and this has been my enduring uncomfortable question, Erin and Sohini. So I'm going to ask you this, right? So there is a school of thought which believes that women and men are not different at all. They are the same. You should treat them the same. You should give them the equal opportunity. There is another school of thought that says that no, women and men are unique and different in their own ways. They're not the same, right? And I always find that the conversation on norms gets stuck between some of these nuances, right? Are women and men the same? Should we treat them the same way? Or are women and men different? You should treat them differently. Because if you treat them the same, then a lot of the same things will apply. If you treat them differently, then where do you draw the line? Do you find that question emerge in your conversation on norms often?
So we often, base these questions on the question of equity. And we say that gender that has been systematically marginalized over, let's say, centuries, have that much more edge over the other gender to kind of be given some extra treatment that would help them to bring them at par.
I think what we're talking about are these societal concepts, right? That we have put, to your point of, and you can think of others, right? You can think of caste, you can think of race, you can think of
abilities,
you can think of economic, socio-economic kind of constructs that we think of and really as ways to categorize people and to place them in groups. And then it's a system that starts to drive ways to kind of control and divide resources amongst them, right? So I think it's ourselves that have, created these constructs. Usually they've been created at times in which we're trying to take limited resources and distribute them in ways that we can justify, to ourselves, right? And then those kind of get, as we're saying, wedded and deeply rooted in the way that we think about these things. And so when you're trying to then create a more equitable You have to sort of, in many cases, say, well, now we have to make up for that historical sort of systematic and systemic level of oppression that we have created in these systems, and until we can get back to a place where there, is more equality. That's kind of one way I think of it.
And to just add a caveat to that, we are talking completely about binaries here.
That's a great point. Yes.
There's an entire spectrum out there which we are not focusing on.
100%. And for me, the metaphor always is of the pendulum swinging. It swung one side till before it gets to the equilibrium, it has to swing to the other side much more. And we have to, as a society, recognize that in some form as well. But for me, that definition, even with well-minded people, the definition of what is the way to this different but equal, and recently I was facilitating a workshop around STEM for girls, Now, the people that are working in this space, very well aware, and are saying that, hey, there are certain concepts in science that boys understand better than girls, according to the way assessments have been proven. But the truth is that the way assessments are designed optimize for those questions that boys do better than girls, because most things like assessments have been designed by men. So one of the things that they were arguing is that acknowledging that there is a difference, can we design a system that provides them equal outcomes? Is that the way to do it? And that's a much more nuanced and a harder conversation to have than saying boys and girls are the same, or that they're very different, which means that you accentuate the differences a lot more than what they're good at in some form, right? But I'd love to come back to that question as we go. Okay, so the question now is, why is this an important problem to solve?
So if you break it up into, let's say, why it's important for families or communities or for nations as a one. So for families, if you leave gender norms unaddressed, it leads to problems of instability within the family. There could be intergenerational trauma. Women typically shoulder 3 times the care work at home than men. Yeah, there's many evidences that would support that. And that reduces their ability to earn. Yeah, and that can lower the family income, put them in poverty. For communities, I have always saw that norms justify violence against women. Child marriage, affecting currently, I believe, about 650 million girls all over the world, is a practice. And post-COVID, we've seen a regeneration of that practice. So further kind of entrenching poverty. And when you talk about migration and displacement, all of this kind of adds to a worsening situation where we have that women often bear the core, the emotional and the core responsibilities of the families that is left behind, while men completely escape from providing caregiving solutions to the family.
Right.
That happens when migration happens. Right. So all of these kind of are not good for the community. And at a community level also, the cycles of discrimination kind of perpetuates. No? So it's good from one generation to another to accept this as a norm and perpetuate this whole cycle of discrimination till it kind of becomes embedded in their culture. And for the economy, we know that the Power of Parity report by McKinsey says that women can add if women are working at joining the workforce, they can add 770 billion to our GDP by 2025, which is we are sitting in 2025 right now. Many zeros, right? And we can do that by just getting 68 million women working. So all of these are things to kind of wrap our heads around. So if we are not addressing norms, families, communities, and the nation are losing out.
Right.
Yeah, globally, the numbers are equally as, kind of disturbing. A World Bank a couple years ago had a report that you're losing 160 trillion in wealth because of the differences in lifetime earnings between women and men. So we're kind of sidelining, as you're saying, a whole segment of the potential, for growth, across all countries. And if you really unpack it, women, in essence, they don't have access to land, to credit, to mobility, to working in, entire sectors. They're often, sort of sidelined in the informal sectors. So their work is there, but it's not being valued. Women are sort of earning less than maybe 20%, even sometimes 10% in a country of formal agricultural labor, but they're actually providing well over 50% of the actual labor, right? So this is not being valued, right? Their work is not being valued. I was actually just reading an interesting article that came out a few days ago about the sleep deficit for women as caregivers, right? Yeah. That was getting some good sort of uptake around the fact that both you're taking care of oftentimes elder members of your family as well as younger members. You're also in many cases still out working, either informally or in a formal employment role, but we're carrying that weight. And so what happens is women literally don't sleep as much as men do, right? Because they're doing all of these extra duties at home and out in society. And that has physical health, consequences. It has mental health consequences with lack of sleep, right? And so, I mean, these are, it just sort of is one of these, huge pile-on effects, every way you look at it, that, that unpaid care gap has a really, I think, big detrimental challenge to, to our families and to, definitely individually to women and girls.
Yeah. But my own sense is, and I've seen this in conversation so many times, both philanthropy and politics have this idea of saying, let's solve a problem we can actually solve. And norms seems like a problem we cannot solve, right? It just seems like, and I think there's a lot of bankers and engineers in governments and administration, and they're always looking for knobs, and they don't seem to find the knobs that can actually give them control on norms, right? It sort of seems like the case, but beginning of the podcast, Erin, you gave this example of how we've seen norms change. In some sense, we've seen norms on how kids do, what social behavior is acceptable, what kind of jokes can be cracked today or what cannot. Yeah. We've changed. Humor has been redefined in our own times in terms of what is there. But in the world of gender, and you've both looked at this now for a few decades, have you seen changes in the way gender norms actually play out? And do you have a sense of what is causing that change in some form?
I don't know whether you've heard of Mandesi Mahila Bank. It's a fantastic, women's bank in India. So when I think in 1997, when Chetna, who was an Ashoka fellow, and that's how I knew her, went to the RBI saying that we want to set up a women's cooperative bank in Satara. They said, very good, and she was in talks when they found out that the 100% of the women were illiterate. They couldn't sign their names. They said, how can we do deals with some people who can't even sign their names? So they said, okay, we'll go back to the drawing board. They went back to the drawing board, and for 6 months, they had adult literacy classes, and they just practiced signing. They practiced signing their names, writing their names on paper. And somehow, 6 months later, they got into a room with some RBI officials, and they said, okay, give us any number and ask us to count interest on them. If we fail, don't give us the bank. But if we don't fail, give us the bank. So they knew that inherently they're good at maths. And they had now the confidence that they can sign their names. Coupled with that, they got the bank. And not only the bank, now they have, management programs for the women. They have so many others, NBFCs, Mandesi has an NBFC. So, it just went from one thing to the other based on that simple fact that women needed to believe in themselves and need to have that one skill that was very essential in getting them the bank. Right. So it is possible to change those norms. And the reason why they wanted those loans in the first place was that banks were giving loan to their husbands who would then squander it away by drinking, and it would not come back to their home. So they decided that those banks are not, we'll have our own bank and we will change the norms in society. And one of the rules that they had was that no man can be given a loan alone. It has to be a joint loan. So, change these simple norms. These are simple norms to push back against. But if you keep on doing that for 10 years, look at where Mandesi has gone from that 1997 to now. Yeah. If I take an example very close to my work, which was with Breakthrough, and we've seen after doing, a gender equity curriculum with adolescents for 5 to 7 years, being consistently, working with the community in sending these messages, working with adolescents to on a gender equity curriculum that tells them that you are equal and you can do anything, we saw an uptick of non-traditional work. So women started working as plumbers, as welders, fighting ward council elections. Those are not, 10 years ago, if you told a UP village that your daughter is going to become a plumber, they'll be like, this is unthinkable. So norms change, they can change. It needs a very careful handling, it needs time, but they do change.
I think we're both the most familiar and often in our education system, which we have done a lot of work in. If you look within education, often it's one of the examples that you can see. There's been lots of research done on conditional caste transfers to have more girls in school in many different regions. What you see is that not only increases the participation of girls in school, but actually changes parental attitudes and beliefs over time. And then you can phase out the actual caste transfer, but girls remain going to school in higher numbers because it's a mindset change that is sustainable. Right. So I think those are kind of system level changes that you see. I think what's interesting, though, is a lot of what we're talking about in these stories are our own, are really individuals that are sort of changing. We have to change our own attitudes and beliefs and behaviors. And then that kind of starts to reshape a group, whether that might be an office setting or a family or a community or a school. Some of the stories I love the most are, we were actually the other day and last week at a conference talking about this with many of our partners from around the world. And we had youth that had come in from different parts of India that had gone through programs, in their teen years, and they were now in their early 20s, and so kind of reflecting back on what worked. And what they were talking about was often, they were exposed to some sort of program that challenged them to take on different care responsibilities and, of younger siblings, or to take on household chores at home, or to take on chores within the school environment. And I think two things that really stood out for me is, one, often it's the boys that get to make those choices to change something that is easier than for a girl, right? I mean, it's easier for a boy to go home and say, I want to help with household chores, than it is for a girl to go home and say, I'm going to stop doing all the household chores. Somebody needs to help me, right? It takes both boys and girls and all binaries to really think about how we treat each other and how we all show up, and what is the alternative kind of, view of these things that we want to create that is more equitable for everybody. So I think we have a lot more influence in peer groups that we have to think about. That is something to think, more deeply, is how to, and that, now happens when we can, touch on technology. This is often happening online as much as it is happening, in person, right? You're seeing things on YouTube or Instagram, and that's where a lot of youth are getting their, sort of gender norms and social norms, are where they're being influenced.
I remember there was this example of India. The stamp duty registration comes down if you have a woman as part of the property owner list, which essentially meant that everybody now, of course, got their wives to sign up, which they never did before. But I also want to take a tricky example where sometimes we change the rule, but the paradigm doesn't change. And for me, the classic example is panchayat leadership electing women. So you have these women panchayat leaders, and there's a man behind. And true story. I go to Orissa, and we have to go to visit one of those cyclone shelters, and the local representatives explain to us. The panchayat leader, who's a woman, comes to talk to us. We ask her a question in Odia, she doesn't respond. We ask her a question in Hindi, she doesn't respond. And her husband starts to explain everything to us, partly correctly, right? Not even perfectly. And of course, as always, the men start to form a group, the women start to form another group. And the panchayat leader, in eloquent Hindi, explains the whole thing to the colleagues of mine who are women, in saying, hey, this is exactly how it actually happens. And she was absolutely right compared to even her husband, right? So she knew it, but the structure didn't happen. And I've seen this play out so many times where I think the intentionality was right with the rule change, but it hasn't shifted the paradigm. Is that something that you see as well? Sometimes play out, saying it becomes a token gesture, but it doesn't change the norm as much.
So you see that all the time in terms of women going out to work. You make, there are mudra yojanas, there are, beti bachao, beti padhao. There is, so many other schemes to get women out to work. But I was talking to a Pune-based organization a few weeks ago. I was there and talking to the young women. They work in skill development and vocational training. And everybody was saying the time when families actually allow, again in quotes, women to work is when there is a family disaster. So the earning member dies, or the father or whoever is the earning member, the head of the earning thing dies, and there is a vacuum. It's then when women go out to work. So careers and aspirations are not built into our curriculum for young women, especially women from marginalized background, poor background. You're not even, so in UP when we first went to work there and we were talking about careers and aspirations, young women and boys couldn't actually describe aspiration. They didn't have a Hindi word for it. So in the absence of that, we coined the word of sapne dekhna, which means to dream. But we girls are not taught to dream. So if you do not talk about a career when you're in school or in your growing up and you're talking constantly about marriage and that is your aspiration or career, then this whole thing of stepping out to work becomes so much more difficult. So you only step out when there's a disaster, when you're forced to. So, and that norm is something that is taking centuries to change, This whole problem of, women participating in the workforce in India. Why is it so low? And even if it has risen now, it's only women in the informal sector or self-employment. Why is that so difficult? While Bangladesh has better results than us.
And so does Sri Lanka. So does Thailand. It's not even that this is a global north and global south problem.
Exactly.
We often say in education, right, you can't be what you don't see. And so a lot of, I think it does matter when you have, women in positions of, sort of power, quote unquote, or whatever that looks like in the workplace or in leadership roles and politics, it makes a difference. But they also have huge responsibility. It's sometimes, too much of a responsibility to represent, and that can be challenging because you have to be the one that speaks up in those situations and, kind of bucks the system and pushes back.
One of the things I often tell people is that, we often see, and I'm talking from an India lens, when the Britishers came, of course, the gunpowder was a huge advantage. Of course, the idea that they had access to technology at that period was a huge advantage. But I think what they carried with them was a certain moral superiority, that we are better people than you, which I think we internalized as Indians. Like we actually, for the longest time, said, actually, maybe that's true, right? There was a Pew Research that was done where scarily 80% of the women normalized violence and said it's okay to be slapped if I made a mistake. And so you're not just working on people around the women, you're working on the women themselves, on what they think they deserve, they're entitled to, and the behaviors that are acceptable for them, which really makes this a lot more of a problem of a long-term nature. Because it's not even that the women are standing up for some of these things as well. Is that something? No,
it's inside out and it's outside in. It goes both ways, right? You get more confident if you see some of the water that you're swimming in changes around you. You get more confident, but you also have to be working, on yourself as well and building that confidence and that, very much being able to internalize these changes. I mean, that's, I think, very true.
But as long as you'll continue to, send a 15-year-old woman out with her 7-year-old brother saying that, oh, he will keep you safe. I mean, there's no way I'm going to internalize anything. I'm going to internalize that I'm unsafe, I'm not capable of taking care of myself. My brother, who is 6 years younger than me, is much better at doing that. And my parents believe that. So I should be going out at night. I should be staying at home. So it's not just women themselves. The community around them, the families around them will have to change. And companies and governments around them will have to change the rules. So, for example, for how long have we spoken with the Delhi government of having a panic button in bus or just having posters on what to do if you're sexually harassed? In Bangladesh, just having posters within the buses have actually brought down incidences of sexual harassment. Simple thing for governments to do. It's a no-brainer. If that brings down and Delhi buses are notorious, right? So if that brings down sexual harassment, more women will be taking public transport to go to work. Simple, simple solutions. But, somehow they do not happen.
So we've been talking about why it's an intractable problem. We've also talked about change is possible. But I think to give this a certain bias for action, I think it'll be great to talk about what are those areas and levers that help us shift norms that you've seen work from your experience. Sohini, I have had the pleasure and joy of working with Breakthrough on your strategy and also the impact that Tarongi Toli has had. And we've also been part of the journey where you've taken it to states and now it's becoming a public education system level initiative. Maybe we start with that and then we move on to other examples of what you've seen change as well.
And, as I said before also, that this needs a life cycle approach. And we begin with schools, So I think one of the things that is important to make it clear for adolescents in school is that gender equitable ideas are not, they're normal ideas. To have gender equitable ideas is normal. To have a gender equitable playing field is normal. That girls and boys are the same and there is no really, big difference among them in terms of what they can achieve and do. That girls are, it's okay to encourage girls to have STEM education. And it's good to have a career. So I think if you start talking about careers and aspirations at a young age, then a lot of things become a little less difficult in later stage. So girls grow up with wanting to do something. And it's just not about earning money, which is very important, but it's not just about earning money. It's about having something of your own, which gives you an identity, which gives you a reason to actually live. Yeah. That's the kind of beginning, schools are the beginning. But we all know that, as we go up the ladder of higher education, girls tend to fall off. So are there, higher education schools closer to communities? Right. That's a structural problem that we are trying to solve. Have more schools in the vicinity, within a 20-kilometer radius, within a 10-kilometer radius, and that's very important because we've seen with our experience of young people that when young people are, when you talk to young people about gender and choices, their aspiration levels go up. And then they find that if they want to go to college, they have no way of going there. So we had a group of girls in a village called Devipur in Haryana who wanted to go to college, and the college was 20 kilometers away from their home, and the parents didn't allow any of the girls to go to college. So the girls all got together. They went to the closest municipal, corporation and spoke to them. And then together they said, why don't we go and talk to the transport department? So they went and talked to the transport department. The transport department started a bus which would stop at 3 panchayats to pick up girls, to take them to the college. So I think 18 girls from that community go to college now. And what is not talked about is that 11 boys also go to college. So, as the girls kind of got this thing done, more and more participation started happening. And I'm sure those numbers have gone up. I'm talking about numbers which are 2 years ago. So more and more numbers must have. So leadership, agency building, aspiration building, I think are 3 crucial things that you can do at a school level. And then you can bring in structural elements like that.
And the reason why we're excited and spend a lot of time now with this kind of collective practice of focus on adolescence and how we shift norms within adolescence lined with the school system is that adolescents by nature of that age love to challenge norms. I mean, that is literally their existence to challenge gender and social norms. So it's sort of like, don't try to swim upstream, like catch them at a moment when this is already the way they are thinking, right? So they are already trying to stretch and break away a little bit from their families and understand what does it mean for themselves, what choice do they have, how do they want to view the world. So that's a very interesting and kind of malleable time to bring up new ideas. And quite frankly, they already have these ideas and they're wanting to find a space, kind of a constructive and creative space to talk about all this, right? So it's really appropriate time at adolescence around school to bring up many of these topics. And really what we're talking about is power and relationships. I mean, that's what a lot of gender norms come down to, right? So when you're talking about, the results of working a lot of these programs you see a reduction in violence, you see a reduction in dropout of schools, it becomes more relevant for youth, right? You see, a reduction in early marriage, many of these things, right, that are problems that we're trying to address in education. When you actually start having candid and constructive conversations around gender, with youth, then many of these things start to shift, right? And so as they're creating an alternative, sort of narrative and system that how they want to see the world, these things follow, right? And so I think it's a really powerful moment, and you should focus on adolescence. And I think schools, in their best form, it's not always the case. They can often double down on harmful norms. But if you can create an environment where you can have these kind of constructive conversations, it can be a very progressive place to help youth and support them in creating the world they want to live in that helps them and helps their peers. I know from Room to Read days, which we have, similar to the really strong program that Breakthrough has, Room to Read for a couple decades have been working on a girls' education program, which is now more of a gender equality program where they're working with, in many cases, boys and girls. And what we saw from the early days is we thought we were just trying to keep girls in school longer to get them through the end of secondary school as the kind of key educational attainment was the key. What we saw over time, though, very early in the program, was that it was not just about the educational components of it. It was also about, sort of the support, the mentoring and support, as well as the life skills curriculum that was more important, than even, sort of the perseverance and performance in school. That was game changing for these girls from themselves, and the alumni will tell you. And so the life skills program has evolved, and now it's addressing many social emotional learning, kind of skills in terms of collaboration and negotiation and problem solving, but also financial literacy skills, also comprehensive sexual education and knowing your body. A lot of it is about knowing your rights, And so this has, been pretty comprehensively now, sort of designed for what boys and girls need. And it's amazing when you now talk to alumni and you say, well, being a part of the Room to Read program, what did that mean to you? And they will be like, life skills. That was the most useful thing. No one else was talking about it. No one else was, doing anything about it. And I'll ask them, I'll say, well, what actually this, again, happened last week where I asked one of the alumni, well, what in the life skills program did you like, the most, or what was most useful? And she said, now in my family, we talk about my periods, and my father, when he goes to the store, he buys me, sanitary supplies, and this is normalized. And not only for my family, it's normalized in my community. Now we all talk about this. It's not something to be ashamed of. It just becomes something that we can all discuss. We now have the language. We have the common knowledge. It's okay to talk amongst boys and girls, amongst parents, and I was like, that's pretty big, right? That is actually just, it's a whole new norm that is now getting set for her and her community. And so I do think that, this is a moment when you can start to make, kind of speed up the pace of change that we're talking about. It does take a while, but I think with these sort of supportive, programs that allow for these conversations to happen, you can see change.
And the other thing that is very important when it comes to gender norms is the unbalanced care work at home.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a reason that a lot of girls drop out of education. That's a reason, in fact, I think there was a Center for Social and Economic Studies research in 2025 that said that out of the women who, drop out of workforce, 68% said that they cannot manage both work at home and work outside. 68% dropped out because of, the caregiving role that they play. And that's where men come in. If there is an ability to share that load, share that work, then you will find a lot of women actually stepping out and women, actually living life to their fullest. Yeah. So I think that's a huge norm that is stopping a lot of women from going out. And that needs to kind of, change. And that actually depends on families, and a lot of it actually depends on men and boys. So
it sort of brings me to the next point, because just to reflect on what you said, recently when we were making the strategy for young people, we'd used Naila Kabir's framework of voice, choice, and negotiation, and saying, do you find your voice? Do you have the choice? And can you negotiate for it? So your example of the adolescent girls finding their voice, negotiating for the bus, and then making it happen is a great example. And what you like you said as well, to then integrate life skills, I think is a very useful framing for that. Mm-hmm. So as part of the girls and they're building their agency to do this is fine. But when it comes to the boys, and I was, I met one of the members of the Accelerator, Ikomundo, and I was asking her the same question, saying, why would boys give up anything? So this is like me having all the privilege of just coming home and lazing in the bed and not having to do the housework when my sister is going to do this and doing everything. And you come and tell me that it's a good thing for you to do the housework. It's like Tom Sawyer selling painting the fence, yeah? So how do you convince boys and men to do this?
Yeah, I don't think it's that simple though, because I think when you talk to young men, there's often, what is kind of being referred to as male toxicity around what their expectations that they have too, that box them in from their perspective as well, right? So they feel pressure to earn, they feel pressure to behave in certain ways that can be very aggressive. It's a lot of expectations that we may not, and they're not all positive. And they're not just like, I get to sit and, play video games where everyone else is doing the work around me, right? There's many cases in which that can turn into isolation, that can turn into not being able to share feelings and express themselves and live their full potential, whatever, creative ways in which they want to do that. And so that sort of, that way that they are boxed in these norms as well can be very harmful too. And so I think that's why when you really work with both boys and girls, men and, young men and young women, you start to realize that this is impacting all of us negatively. And if we can all kind of sign up for a new alternative sort of, positive way to think about everyone having the choice and being supported in their full potential, that is something that's a meeting ground where, we can all meet.
Yeah, and asking boys just to be allies is not working anymore.
Yeah.
Allyship is, it's outdated. It's not.
They have to see what's in it for them.
They have to see what's in it for them. They must realize that patriarchy is as harmful for women as it for men.
I just keep coming back to this conversation around gender norms is, again, really about power and relationships, right? There's a lot of fancy terms we can use. I mean, even the term norms, right? People are like, what does that even mean, right? But, it really is about shared power and relationships. And how do we all choose to be in relationship with each other? And what are ways that we can be more supportive and understanding and really hear each other? Because these constructs that we have are not working for men. They're not working for women. They really aren't helpful.
And now coming back to the context, so we've talked about the people themselves, the boys and the girls, the environment in which they're growing up. And I know teachers play a significant role. Even as part of your Accelerator, you've taken the public education system as a critical lever because it has so much power. Is it, one, how do you see the roles teachers will play? And are you seeing evidence of shifting teachers, the norms that they hold in their heads, because they reinforce it so much with the children that they work with to happen?
And it's hardest to do with the teachers, and especially teachers from the global south, where their jobs are not respected. They don't get paid that much, and then they are on duty for everything. But I believe that when you start talking teachers about their own experiences in life, then they see the value of having a gender equity lens in their work much more important, and just an anecdote, and I really love telling this story, is that when we started working in Punjab, there was one teacher who would not come to the training sessions or would come and not participate, and she was only just doing it because the government was asking her to do it. And then, suddenly she became very regular and she came and she started doing it all. And then in September, there was a meeting with all the officials and everybody. And she stood up and she told this story. She said, I come from a wealthy family. My husband has a business of his own. We have a car. We have 2 cars, and I've always wanted to buy a car and drive. But my husband always said, we have a car, this is our car, you don't need to drive. And then they were coming back from some place and they had this argument in the middle of the road, and the husband said, get out from my car. And she said, when I walked back home, I realized that this is not my car, really. I need to actually, it all dawned on me, why am I doing these classes? What is gender equity? What is wrong with my life? She said, I resolved to buy a car, and now I bought a car and I drive myself everywhere. I don't depend on our car anymore. And this was such a powerful story, and it happened because you could experience it in your life, right? The things because otherwise gender and norms are just concepts and definitions that you don't apply to your life. But if you do really have experiential work with the teachers themselves, then they begin to see, And also, there are fantastic teachers who go out of their way to pay for a girl who's not been able to study. So there are teachers like that. And if their stories can be shared, I think this is where storytelling and really talking one-to-one and talking to them as a group kind of really helps. And I'm sure there are lot of evidences out there now.
That's going to be interesting because in this collective of the 12 partners, the first topic that they want to synthesize their shared learnings and experiences on is actually teacher training and how to engage teachers on this topic of shifting adolescent gender norms, because we know they are critical, right? They're critical up the chain to headmasters and school administration and, all levels, and they're critical down to they're the ones in the classroom, often delivering these programs, engaging with youth, engaging with parents, right? So they are the linchpin in many ways to this work. So I think it'll be very interesting to see. There's been a lot of work on this, and again, it is an inside out as well, right? They have to be able to understand how does patriarchy impact their lives in order to really, embrace and get behind, delivering a program that's talking about having these candid and constructive conversations on norms. So I think that'll be, a wonderful contribution to see across contexts. How do they differ again across countries and different kinds of cultural contexts, across different interventions in schools and pathways to working on norms? Where, what are the teachers' role and how did they, what worked in terms of bringing them on board? I think it'll be very interesting.
Yeah, because I was recently talking to another organization where they talked about initially assuming that when you put women teachers to engage with girls, you find a much more positive outcome because women teachers will be more motivating, and they realized that the men teachers were equally motivating as well, and sometimes the message was even more powerful because it's coming from a man that you can do this, and they were vociferous champions.
Yeah.
And I'm also wondering, and as the learnings get synthesized, to say what changes it. Because if it's inside out, it's that personal experience and you manifest it. But if it has to be at scale, what can be that outside in lever that will shift teachers' behavior?
Yeah, it's got to be both ways.
Yeah.
I mean, interesting enough, I think the interesting research happening now too is around at the headmaster school leader level.
Yeah.
And the impact that a female school leader can have is quite high. They've seen in embracing and being able to create the space for many of these conversations, and yet you don't see that many school leaders at that level, right? Yeah. They're allowed to be in the classroom, but they're not allowed to hold leadership positions. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting place to tease out some of these roles too, of what does it look like to have more females headmasters and school leaders.
And I've seen in Haryana, in some schools where there are women headmistress, schools look beautiful, they're clean, they're cleaner, they have, lovely posters.
Talk about gender norms right
now.
Cuts both ways, man.
And more conversations and things like that. Yeah. Just an anecdotal thing, but yeah.
Of course. Stakeholder I want to touch before we move on is parents. Again, a very, very influential set of stakeholders, usually in families where there's a boy and a girl. Of course, there's a difference. Where it's just only girls, there's a difference. And I remember in one of our conversations, Erin, one of the points that you made also, it's also one of the more difficult stakeholders to engage in terms of changing this, because teachers are in an institutional system. The kids themselves, like you said, are swimming downstream anyway. But the parents are harder. But I don't know what your learning has been. And I'm also, again, just to frame it, I'm asking it from the lens of the people listening to this are designing programs and systems to solve for this challenge. And they also have to look at which leverage points have the highest impact. How would you look at the role of parents, one, but also the parents as an intervention stakeholder or a leverage in this conversation?
So, a lot of gender norms get entrenched at home.
Yeah.
So it's very, very important to address things at home. In any program with adolescents, I would say teachers and parents are equal stakeholders, and you have to talk to them, which is why, I was talking to a few of our partners there, and a lot of them work only in schools, and they're saying, kind of having a community engagement is important, because if you do not have community engagement, then you're not getting the parents, in a group. Just talking to one parent will not do the thing. Yeah. So there has to be, and again, that takes time. So it is, changing community norms is the hardest, I feel. Even if individual norms change, community norms take a lot of time to change. But if you really engage from a point of what is good for the community,
right?
And is it good for community to have educated girls? Nobody will say no. Everybody will say yes. And so if everybody says yes, what is the best way of them doing it? So if you sometimes we go to the communities with agendas which are not their agenda. But how can you actually work with a community to make it their agenda is a challenge, but it can be done.
Right.
And many organizations have done it. They have done it in terms of drinking water, or done it in terms of agriculture labor, done it in terms of child marriage. So what's stopping you to, even if you're working in, let's say, climate action, or you're working in agriculture, reforms, to have that lens of talking to communities about changing norms, which would actually help them in any of the work that they do.
Yeah, and there's always community influencers, right? I mean, I think the way most organizations, try to do it is kind of identify who are those most influential, kind of key leaders in, sometimes it may be in the formal role, sometimes it may be in informal, just whose house does everyone go to and chat, in the evening, or, these types of things, right? And there's usually centers of power that people gravitate around, right? Yeah. And so, kind of identifying, inviting them into the conversation. And often the conversation is very simple, right? I mean, in terms, you're not trying to ask for, deep and immediate change right off the bat, right? Maybe it's just like, let's just meet and talk about this and see what is, how can we support our children? Or if it's, in girls' education, certainly some of the easiest things can just be like, ask your child, what did you learn in school today? Tell me something new. What, walk with them to school and talk about their day, or walk home, from school and talk about, just be encouraging, spend a little bit of time. These things are actually quite hard, and particularly for people who are already working in, long hours, and in, many cases, they do not have that custom, kind of built in, and don't have the opportunity and can't afford to necessarily spend time. And so you have to find really simple levers in which you can help parents engage with, children and talk about these things, and just normalize it as a sort of way to have a simple but important touch point. And that, builds on itself, right? And as you start to create that opportunity. And so I think we know to do that to a certain extent in education, around educational attainment. Can we now start to find ways to do that around norms, right? Yeah. And how do we have those simple, encouraging kind of moments where you just can connect and discuss things?
Yeah. Yeah. And having elected representatives and government officials on your side is, again,
big difference.
Make a huge difference.
Just one, this interesting shift that you made from talking to parents to talking to community.
Yeah.
And just looking at them as individual people, think of them as a collective structure. Second is, I work with an organization where they usually identify 5 leaders of influence, which is they go with the religious leader, the school leader, right, the political leader, and then they look at the health worker, right? Yeah. And then there's one more, I think, that they identify, and then say, hey, among this, there's a diffusion of power. Right? And then you find out the learned one, which is the person in that community who's learned a lot. Right? So they typically use this to say, hey, who do we have to engage with, and how do we work with better, etc.
Yeah, that's great.
And I think it sort of goes back to the point that you're working on, which is building a much stronger evidence base on this, to say, hey, this works, then makes it a lot more easier for us to be able to do this. Like I said, I want to switch gears a little bit, because we've been talking about people, but as I had our conversation today, I've also realized this is also about institutions and spaces and so on. The way you design a city, the way you arrange transport routes, the way you would run elections, the way you would conduct exams, all of this also reinforces. It's not about people, it's just the systems have to be designed with a lens in mind as well. Is that something that comes up in your conversations? And also, are you seeing examples of system design changing, not people? Would love to hear your thoughts on moving away from people as a driver for norms, but also to look at systems as a way of shifting norms as well.
And also organizations and companies.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things that that is very important is to look at, and when it comes to women's workforce and women's participation in the workforce, is transport systems and how safe they are. We worked in a project, as Breakthrough, we worked in a project in a women's factory. And we found that women would take autos, shared autos, from their home to their workplace. And they found it very disconcerting, because the auto driver would adjust his rear view mirror to look at them. He'd play loud body music, So we had a meeting of all the auto drivers, and we had, several meetings, and we said, can we give you a list of songs which are not so loud and not so bawdy and not so, not so demeaning to women. But the women themselves like those songs and Ganju play those songs. And the auto drivers agreed, and there was a lot of this, the women themselves wrote songs. So there was a lot of whole things. The point I'm trying to make is that you have to really look at what the root of the problem, and if you tweak a little bit of that problem, how can you actually solve for a large mass of people? Because it wasn't as if the songs were a problem. It wasn't as if the behavior was really bad, but the songs were a lot of a problem. So if tweaking that can actually help you.
Right.
And I think some of those systems and some of this transport work that we've been doing is to do with just tweaking simple things. There's a Good Samaritan law in Delhi. I think now worldwide, and I think now in countrywide, which says that if you help somebody in distress, you can report it to the police. You do not have to divulge your identity. You can do it. Can we not include that, extend that Good Samaritan law to include violence against women as well, or sexual harassment of women? You report a case, you do not have to divulge your identity, so you're not, exposing yourself to the risks, but at the same time that crime gets committed. Or, having a push button in a bus, or having a leaflet or a poster in the bus saying, these are the ways, these are the numbers to call. The government has all the infrastructures, but it doesn't get used because people do not have information. So, some of those things, And when it comes to companies, I think, and I read somewhere that women often drop off jobs when they have night shifts.
Yeah.
Women often drop off jobs when there is no creche.
Yeah.
These are simple things for organizations to do. Ensure that there is a safe travel alternative for the woman to go back home at night. There's a creche at the workplace. Simple things which can actually change the system.
Right.
And make it, possible.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge I have in this, when you talking about the systems level, is, ultimately systems are made up of people, right? And they make choices and priorities, right? And, how they decide to divide resources. I mean, that's essentially, a budget is, kind of a representation of your values and your prioritization, right, of those values. And so these things exist. We all know there are like some of these levers that are not that difficult, but yet we still choose not to do them. Is the reality, right? Governments choose, corporates choose not to, whatever level, the system is at, we choose to not make these changes, even though we know there are a lot of best practices out there and promising strategies that could, drive towards different results. So I think at this point, in maybe I'm getting a little bit jaded at my, at this point after a long career of working on these things. But I'm like, it kind of goes back to, can we really change mindsets and maybe start in ways like, because even I love the example you gave. Like, you really just had to sit down then with the auto drivers and the women have a conversation and try to be like, hey, all of us actually can agree probably on more than we disagree on, right? Yeah. And we probably have more incentives that are, wanting to support each other. I mean, they want more rides, they want to create an environment. They may not know what they're doing, and women, so if we can talk to each other, can we try to have this conversation? And again, in an open and constructive way and kind of find some meeting grounds, then we start to shift, our mindsets around this, and then we start to see that ripple effect. So I think I'm much, rather than taking on the whole system, which can sort of feel like, where do you start? And, you pull one string and it just, keeps going. Are there ways that, we can think about this in more manageable ways?
For me, my learning has been, Erin, that it's an and.
Yeah, it's an and.
In a sense, yes, now I've worked with people in the system who are well-intentioned, but it's just stuck because there's I think it was Prosperity or a non-profit recently that just went to the government and said, here are the 5 laws you have to change for you to get more women to work. And all of them were innocuous things. It's probably Winston Churchill put it there or something, right? Like, we don't even know why. And the government was like, absolutely, we can change all of this. But they didn't know because then that was causing liability issues for companies. And so shifting and
but I would challenge you on that, because India is one place, I will say, and there's many other countries that have fantastic laws. And if you actually did an analysis of the laws, in many cases they'd be like, yeah, that's great, everything's there.
Yeah.
But do we see that show up in our everyday lives? Do we see that show up in our, in the practice of the policies? It's harder, right?
So what I'm saying is, it's an and.
It's an and, but I wouldn't start, I guess, only at that level. I think that's why it's much more about creating the shared, sort of mindset of how what we believe and what we want to prioritize, and what we are really, kind of unpacking. Why do we not do these things if we know that they will shift the outcomes we're driving for? What is preventing us? And having that conversation, at smaller levels, so that we can then start to demonstrate how to, I think people respond well when you see an example of something having shifted and you say, okay, we can actually do that. That was just one, 2, and 3, as opposed to trying to take on the whole system.
With the safe transport systems. For me, it's one thing that can create I was talking to a bunch of women, I was doing a focus group discussion.
Yeah.
One of the points that they mentioned is just that they said, if I could get enough money, the first thing I will do is to not want to go in that system.
The
public transport system,
yeah.
right? I today go because I have no other choice, but if I had a choice, I will never go
opt
out.
Yeah.
Right? Either I will buy a car or I'll stop working. Because for me, that's not worth it.
Right.
And I'm saying changing it one driver at a time to then saying, hey, is there another lever for us to pull? I think will be very, very useful as well. And which is why for me, at some point, and I think we've discussed it multiple times in our conversations, systems designed for women. Is also another useful, a challenge, because we just are invisible. Some of these things are invisible as well.
And see, that's why I would go and I would try to then influence in the places you could. Where are these specific municipalities that are willing to demonstrate that shift can actually drive a different experience, right? And so that's what I guess it is, sort of like the bottoms, up, top, down, but you have to find the level that you can actually create the change the fastest. And I mean, whatever that level is at, it's different in different contexts, right? But I think it's like then getting to not just talking about the law, but let's go do it. Why can't we just actually change the button on the bus? It's not that hard, right? To do something like that if there's real, political will and joint commitment to doing it.
Yeah, and I think, a funny incident just, came to my mind is that, the Delhi government stopped, they wanted women not to pay for any bus rides.
That's right.
So they made it free, right? So the result apparently is that more women using the bus. But on the other side, on the flip side, the conductors and the bus drivers do not stop for women. Because they're free passengers. So, and that's where the bottoms up.
Unintended consequences.
It's an unintended consequence. And that's where the bottoms up. How many women did you talk to before you kind of, did this law?
Experience from Karnataka in Bangalore, apparently conductors started telling the women, anyway, you don't pay for this, what are you asking for?
Right.
And then the women saying that, listen, I'm a customer, but you're not paying for it.
Yes.
Right? So then becomes a dole out, then I don't have to treat you well. Right? So, complex problem. We spoke about labor force participation. And one of the aspects of labor force participation, we also talked about how Bangladesh and Sri Lanka have done it well. Part of why they did it well in my analysis is also because pathways that can scale became part of the cultural milieu. For example, care workers going abroad became a norm in Sri Lanka, because of which Sri Lankan women started working abroad, and that had a cascade impact. Garment industry and Bangladesh, classic example that, it was okay. And so when you unlock, not at a larger level, but for that particular career opportunity, you unlock the possibility of women being able to do it. Even in India, for example, rural women in Orissa can come all the way to Bangalore to work in garment industry. Sometimes they are informal workers, sometimes they're not paid the best. The question is, what are barriers that we set up for women in careers, especially that are high-paying, high-value, and leadership roles?
Before you go to the high-paying, high-level, even if you take the agricultural sector, let's say, and the contribution of women to agricultural sector is all unseen.
Right.
Because women work on the land that are owned by men. So even if the woman is working throughout the year as a daily labor in the family plot, her name is never going to show up. So can we give visibility to the jobs that women are already doing in the agricultural and affiliated industries? That's one of the ways of doing it. I think the second thing is that enrollment in engineering is over 96% for women.
Yeah.
When it comes to manufacturing jobs, only 12% of women join the workforce. So what happens between
drop off.
getting your degree and then joining the workforce? Because these are also again perceived by male-dominated spaces where women do not want to work and they do not feel safe, or they do not feel, this is a nice location for me to kind of be in work. So how can we actually, I don't have answers, but these are things that we have to kind of keep in mind when we are
But I think that's a critical component that we're missing, that we've done a better job at some of the skilling, but not at the wraparound services that needed to support an environment in many corporate contexts. It's again the things that we've, Sohini has mentioned, but it's is there a creche there? Is there safe transportation? Is the workplace safe?
Yeah.
What is the, mentoring that a woman has in that environment? What are the pathways for career growth? I mean, there's a lot of different ways in which we're still, we're valuing it maybe on the training and then just placing, getting placed into the job, but not on creating a constructive environment that is really, focused on gender equality.
Absolutely. But going back to that agriculture example, Sohini, I think for me, the problem with taking that allied approach, sometimes there's a measurement problem. You're just not counting it as work. Because today there are more women in agriculture than men, but we don't count the women's work, so that's a problem. The second is, I've always realized in any economic transactions, producers make the least amount of money and the traders make the most amount of money. Right?
Yeah.
It is the artisan doesn't make the money, the merchant makes the money.
Right.
And the person making the jams doesn't make the money, the person who's selling the jams is making the money. And we've made commerce as something that women are not supposed to do. You can't go to the market, you can't sell, you can't bargain. In some of those roles, do you feel there's a greater risk that we'll make them the impoverished producer in some form and not the trader?
Risk, but also the norms there, because I just read somewhere that only 5% of startup money actually went to women in 2024.
Yeah.
Why is that? And when women start doing things, families tell them, chota se shuru kar lo. I mean, start small and then it will grow. But if a son wants to go and do a business, it's like you've got the, blessing of the entire family. These things need to change. We're talking about entrepreneurship big way in our country. We're talking about more entrepreneurship than job development. But if we have to back it up with the norms, we are not doing that. So women have to be told that you are capable of starting a business on your own. You are capable of getting the money, going out to the market and selling. Look how it has transformed the fishing industry, right? If you take the fisher folks in Maharashtra, the men go out and buy the fish. The women come to the market and sell. And they have the control on the money because, they know that if it goes to the men, it'll all go into the next, atta that there is. But so, these things need to be changed. And norms play a big role in that.
And by the way, Sattva did an analysis of mudra loans that I provided. And what they realized is that all women took the first level loan. Very few women took the second level loan, which is the higher top up. But men, on the other hand, took the first loan and moved very quickly to the second loan. Right? So, in some sense, where do you sort of set that lifestyle business challenge to a truly growing business challenge? I think is very important. And I think I just want to reiterate what doesn't work as well in what we're talking to say, hey, I'm going to push this one thing, which is I'm going to skill people and not do all the other things that are required. I've actually gone to a cement plant where there is no toilets for women.
Exactly.
Because they just assume that all people there are men. And so one of my colleagues who had come to the plant had to hold it.
We had a wonderful discussion a week before last on this Reframe conference that Breakthrough did about women drivers. There's so many women drivers, not enough toilets for women drivers. And it becomes even more muddled when there are transgender drivers. Which toilet do they go to? Do they go to the men's toilet? If the men see them, they would be, they don't know what abuse there would be. If the women see them, they will beat him up or her up. Because, so these are problems that need to be structurally also sorted through.
Absolutely. Systems designer, Jim. So in the last part of this podcast, just want to talk about, if people are going to listen to this are going to think, hey, this is great conversation. What should I be doing? Right? I'm a philanthropist. I'm running an education program. Gender is not my priority, but I want to be gender aware in the work that I'm doing. Are there some top of mind things that you would tell corporate leaders, philanthropists, decision makers in policy spaces to keep in mind as they think about this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that we should be thinking much longer term as a general rule for philanthropy about our investments. And we know in this conversation we're talking about things that are deep rooted, hard to change, take, building up and really investing, at individual as well as systems levels, as we talked about. And so it's going to take, time and that amount of time on doing these 2-3 year kind of project grants and expecting to see, sort of change is unrealistic, right? So I think we have to first, I would encourage everyone to really think about gender and what is that gender lens in their work so that they can be analyzing the opportunities for their investment. If you're a philanthropist, to always be asking questions, around gender. How does it show up in the work and, how are you considering it? But then also to think about how do you provide that longer time frame and more flexible funding so that you can really give organizations the encouragement, to dig in and to start to work on these very complex issues. And I think the same is true for CSR, right? That is a big audience, obviously, of philanthropists now that are investing is coming, from corporate. So this is layering on work that they're already trying to do in many cases in their own workplaces. They're thinking about gender in many ways, and they could be probably learning a lot from their community partners that they're investing, having this conversation about what works, right, that they can bring back into their own corporate settings. And likewise, they can be investing in this work. And so it's a very, kind of symbiotic, I think, relationships that are talking about gender and how it shows up, because many of the things that we're talking about in terms of changing society and communities, are beneficial for corporates, right, around gender, more women in the workplace, more women being able to, earn money, to be spending that money and, and making decisions themselves over where to spend and what companies and what brands to get behind, right? This is all very much, sort of self-supporting in itself in how to look at it. So I think there's a lot of ways that, we should be thinking about how to make gender just a regular part of any way that we look at the work that we're supporting or the work that we're doing.
And listen to women. When you're framing your policies, when you're framing your laws, for companies to listen to women, what do they want? Is a very important task, which we never do. We just frame things and put it out there.
And I think the other part that I wanted to sort of highlight and get your thoughts on also is just make norms and gender visible. Even disaggregating data by women and women or the other genders that you're supporting. And watching and listening to possible ways in which unintended biases are shaping up in conversations maybe is very, very important. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do. And the way we are, even for programs who are trying to kind of look at gender as a response, maybe, it's important to evaluate their programs from that lens. And that's what we talk about with many organizations who are now wanting to many organizations wanting to put in a gender lens. I don't know why, but it's a good idea. I always feel that's a good idea. But you have to evaluate your programs from that lens. And you have to look at barriers in your program for women that are there, which are very, very important for you to look at. I think one of the things that also doesn't happen is, I think we need to break down the word gender, because the moment you say gender, people are like, we don't fund gender, or we don't, work on gender. But how can we show you that working on gender is good for your issue, the issue that you are working.
And also, I think the point you mentioned about the signaling on gender, not wanting to dig deeper is another problem. I had a donor who came to me and said, please don't tell me your program is gender in the 5th line of your proposal and then in the last line of your proposal, and there is nothing else in between. Because you haven't thought about where intentionally you're including gender. You're just saying, we have these women champions. That doesn't make it a gender program. Because sometimes we also signal to the capital that we are trying to attract, partly also why I think some people want to do it, but to be intentional about it. Saying, am I truly asking the questions of what holds women back, I think is very, very important.
And I think it's hard because, again, getting to the individual level, we have a hard time asking these questions and talking about these things,
Yeah,
right? Because we all feel like maybe we're going to make a mistake and say the wrong thing, or we're going to bring up something that is going to be too personal, or, and so I think we also just have to get comfortable being uncomfortable talking about these things, because we are most likely going to trip up a little bit, and it will be, and that's okay. If the intention is to learn and to try to, really listen and hear, and really be open to changing, then we're going to make some mistakes along the way. But that's if the true intention is there, keep going. Like, don't be scared off from having this conversation. And I think that's true in many places now, and particularly in corporates, they've kind of now shied away from a lot of this conversation. And I'm not sure that that's helping. I think the time is to dig in and to continue to have those forums and those spaces to really talk about these issues and what's working and what's not working in our shared culture that we're, that organizational culture that, we all have a responsibility to invest and to support. And that's, it's an okay conversation. Don't be, shy and not want to talk about it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the pervasive fear of being cancelled
in
any conversation is very real.
Yeah, that's very real, and that's not helped us now on many of these tough issues around, social and gender norms.
Absolutely. Erin, Sohini, thank you so much for the conversation. I always summarize what we talked about, but I don't want to do that this time. But I want to leave with what stayed with me. I think the first part of it is really this idea that this is everywhere in all different ways. And I think the point that somewhere in the conversation you mentioned about starting with ourselves and the choices we make in what we do goes a long way in driving this conversation. There's also in this Hindu philosophy, there's this idea that don't change the world, change yourself, and the world takes care of itself, right? Yeah, so I think for me, that was a very powerful reminder. And I was just, as we were having a conversation, reflecting on even personal experiences and learnings on where that plays out, right? And the second thing is, it really takes a village to change a thing like this. It's not you're going to press that one teacher, you're going to look at that one youngster, you're going to look at that one parent. Collective entities have a certain shared behavior, and unwritten rules are only changed through shared behavior. It's not defined by what one person is going to do. And these ripples that we create, I think is really what is going to be important. And the third is, where do the ripples start from? In so many places. It could start from the auto driver playing the right song. It could start from a poster in the bus. It could start from a person asking her parents to do something.
And to a law. I mean, it's all levels, right?
Exactly. And I think this idea that the top down and bottom up have to meet at some point, right?
Yeah.
We need the champions, and we need to power the champions with the right systems. One without the other is not going to cut it. And there's no magic wand. We just have to finding it, I think is important. Yeah. And to also finally to end with this idea that while this is so pervasive, so it's such a globally relevant but hyper-locally sensitive conversation.
Yeah. Yes.
You can talk about norms in any room, and there are women and men who are going to say, I totally relate to it, but the context in which they relate to it is so different.
Yes.
And hence, having this conversation, and also more importantly, the work that you do of bringing evidence together from various parts of the world and creating a learning network that can help inform the work that we do is so important. Yeah. So thank you so much for this conversation and for doing what you do.
Thank you for having us and for caring about the topic.
Yes.